Okay, fantastic. So we'll make a start. I can't see anybody, so you'll have to um, just put. I don't know if you can put a hand up on Zoom, but either way, pop it in the chat um, or speak out loud, whatever is your preference in terms of sort of communicating with me. But if there's anything that you'd like to feed back to me as the presentation goes, please feel free to do so. There is a QR code there in the corner of the screen. If you'd be able to scan that, um, I think I put it again at the end, but that will be a QR code to any questions that you have. So if there's anything that comes up, anything that you'd like to ask, that'll send you an anonymous feedback form. So I've got that loaded up and ready to go to address at the end. So I'm going to try and aim, and it's very roughly, but try and aim roughly for about 40 minutes worth of presentation. And then I'll try to give some time at the end to be able to answer any questions that are there as well. I'm just going to, if you would be able to mute your mics, that would be absolutely amazing. Just so that I'm the only one that appears on there. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay. So I'm Owain. I'm a UKSBA practicing member, and I am the founder of Drive Behaviour Consultancy, which is my behaviour consultancy business. I've put my email address and website up there as well, so you can find me online. I've got a little bit more information on my website about parent and carer consultations, a little bit on what those might look like, fees, etc. So please feel free to check those out if you would like to get in touch with me at the end of today and schedule a one-to-one consultation and a bit more support. But yeah, please feel free to scan that feedback form and we will get started. So, okay. As I said, the session's going to be recorded. I'm hoping it is being recorded now if Zoom's on my side. So please feel free to keep your cameras off. As I say, I've reduced it down to a thumbnail in the corner, so I don't think that any names are going to come up. But please feel free to change your name on Zoom if you would like to make 100% sure of that. Fantastic. Thank you, Jackie. Yes, it's been recorded. Brilliant. So the webinar's going to be about 40 minutes, about 20 minutes of questions. I will ask that those questions are kept to sort of general questions only, just because if there's any sort of specific questions, i.e., my child engages in this very specific behavior in this very specific context, any tailored advice would require a little bit more kind of consultancy from myself to be able to get to the bottom of the situations in which that behavior is occurring. So, yeah, any questions, please feel free to ask away. If you're not sure, ask, and I can always say, actually, I'll have to leave that one for another time, for example. But absolutely, ask any questions that you'd like to. In terms of the terminology, I'm going to try throughout this presentation to refer to behaviours of concern rather than challenging behaviour. And there's a few reasons why we do that. Firstly, because the term challenging behaviour we've kind of moved away from, in that any sort of, I guess, all behavior is functional, and we'll come on to that at a later date. So all behavior happens for a reason, and there isn't a behavior that occurs that is inherently, like in and of itself, always challenging. Let's take hitting, for example. If I'm in a boxing match, for example, then that behavior is going to be appropriate, but if I'm in a different context, it may not be. So to label a behavior as challenging behavior doesn't quite give the nuance to the context in which that behavior occurs. It also recognizes that actually the intention behind that behavior of the child is not to challenge, it's actually to communicate. And that if the child is having to communicate that in that way, that should be concerning to us, because it should indicate that actually there's an unmet need there. There's a reason why that child is trying to communicate that in that context. And therefore, we refer to behaviors of concern instead. So I will, obviously, I've titled the presentation, why does challenging behavior happen, just because everybody knows what challenging behavior is, but I'm going to try to refer to it as behaviors of concern as we go. Okay, so aims and objectives of today. Hopefully by the end of today, we'll be able to understand the ways that challenging behavior might form, recognize why it continues over time, why it might occur at higher rates or severities over time, and the ways that we might be able to prevent challenging behavior through positive and proactive strategies. So hopefully you'll all be able to walk away with a few ideas about how we understand why behavior might be occurring and what we can do to support that child. I know that we've got a mixture probably in the room of parents, carers, and professionals, but hopefully this will be a really good introduction for everybody. And the first place for us to start is in recognizing that all behavior happens for a reason. And the behavior is kind of like an iceberg. I guess to introduce it, what we see of a behavior is just the bit that's above the surface. And so we see that overt display of aggression or self-injury or environmental damage. What we don't see is what's going on underneath the surface for that child, and that's the biggest part of my role, and that's the biggest part of what we're going to be focusing on today is in addressing that question of why does challenging behavior happen. We have to look below the surface for that child or young person. We have to recognize that there is a reason why that behavior is occurring. That behavior is occurring because there's an unmet need for that child. That child has a need that they are trying to communicate to us. They don't have a better way to communicate, whether that is the need for something, an item, an activity. It might be a need for interaction. It might be a need to get out of a situation that's really undesirable to that child. But whatever the need is, there's a need that's driving that behavior. There's something underneath the surface. And it's our role then to be able to figure out for that child, what is that child trying to communicate to us? Because once we can do that, then we can put things in place to meet that need and to support that child and reduce that behavior from occurring. And there could be a variety of ways why that behavior might be occurring, but those are essentially the reasons why that behavior is happening. So if we think about something called the ABC cycle, which is antecedent behaviors and consequences, and we'll go through this in a lot more detail, we'll break it down. But essentially, this is the way that we understand why behavior maintains over time, why it continues over time. Antecedents are the things that happen before the behavior. Consequences or outcomes are the things that happen after the behavior. So if we start with antecedents or triggers, these are the things that can either happen immediately before the behavior, or they can be things that happen several minutes, hours, even days before the behavior sometimes. But they're things that essentially indicate to that person that if they engage in a certain behavior in that environment, that it's going to gain a desirable outcome, that outcome is going to be good for them. It's going to meet that underlying need. So as I say, that can be fast triggers, so things that happen immediately before that behavior, or it can be slow triggers, things that kind of build up over time that make that behavior much more likely to occur. And consequences then or outcomes are anything that happens after that behavior, good, bad, weird, wonderful, or otherwise. So I guess parenting programs kind of use the word consequences to be synonymous with like punishment, and that's not the way that we understand it in sort of behavioral science. It's more about recognizing that anything that happens after a behavior is a consequence, is an outcome, and that's why I kind of like to prefer to use the word outcomes, because you don't get the confusion with that synonymous sort of punishment. So anything that happens after the behavior is an outcome of that behavior. And largely speaking, good outcomes mean that the person does it again. Bad outcomes mean the person doesn't do it again, which is kind of like kind of makes sense. So if a child engages in a certain behavior in a certain context and it has a good outcome, when they're in that same context in the future, they're more likely to do that behavior. If they engage in a certain behavior in a certain context and it doesn't get a good outcome, then they're less likely to do that behavior again in the same context. And essentially, when we think of so we go back to the ABC cycle of behavior. So we've gone through very briefly that what we mean by the antecedent. So the antecedent being the things that happen before that behavior, the things that signal that, if I engage in this behavior now, it's going to gain a desirable outcome. That's our antecedents, the things that happen before the behavior, the things that spark that behavior off, essentially. And our consequences are the outcomes, anything that happens after that behavior. When we're referring to the outcomes, there's four kind of broad categories of outcomes of behavior, which we call the four functions of behavior. And those are sensory, escape, attention, and tangible. So any outcome of behavior can largely be categorized into one of those four functions, one of those four reasons why behavior happens. So sensory related behaviors are ones where the behavior in and of itself gains a desirable outcome for that person. So things like, for example, if we're working with a child who's autistic, stimming is a really good example of a sensory related behavior, because the behavior in and of itself gains a desirable outcome. It doesn't need to be mediated by anybody else in the environment. It doesn't need anybody around that person to do anything. The behavior in itself changes that person's sensory system in a way that is desirable for them. So it could be, for other, people, it might be like things like sort of biting our nails, sort of fidgeting, stuff like that. Anything that immediately gains some sort of feedback to our sensory system. Escape is where the child or young person tries to get out of doing something that they don't want to do, or to get out of an environment that is undesirable for them by engaging in that behavior. So it's to get out of doing something they find unpleasant or difficult or aversive in some way. Attention then is about gaining the actual interaction itself from the behavior. So it's not that the child wants to gain your attention in order to ask for something. It's not that the child wants to gain your attention in order to get out of a situation. It's that the attention itself, in and of itself, is the thing that the child is seeking. And that's an important distinction to make. And the tangible is, items or activities that child or young person enjoys. So iPad is a very strong tangible that comes up a lot, but iPads are a perfect example of a tangible, because they're a specific item that child is going to be wanting and maybe seeking as a result of that behavior of concern. The reason why it's so important to make the distinction between attention and the other functions is that we can quite often overestimate the role of attention and label a child's behavior as quote unquote attention seeking without really actually understanding why that behavior is occurring. And it may well be the case that, as I say, that child is communicating to us that they need our support in order to access something, or they need our support to get out of a situation that they're really struggling with, whereby the function there would be escape or tangible. So it's important to make that distinction, that actually not all behavior that gets your interaction is maintained by that interaction itself. There are some behaviors that get your attention, but are actually in order to ask for something or in order to get out of that situation. So it's important to make that distinction. And that's sometimes where we overestimate the role of attention, is because a lot of behavior, our natural response to challenging behavior is to interact with that person in some way, to ask them what they need, to try to problem solve with them and try to find out what they're needing from us. But it's important to recognize that that attention may not be what's maintaining that behavior, or it may be. But that's for us to figure out. So reinforcement then is when we are again looking at those kind of like the outcomes of behavior. Reinforcement is the process of a behavior increasing by means of it getting a desirable outcome. So challenging behavior or behaviors of concern occur more often when it's reinforced. And that means that when a behavior occurs in a specific context, if that behavior gains a desirable outcome, it increases in frequency in the future. And that's what we mean by reinforcement, is that process of increasing the likelihood of that behavior occurring again in the future. And we can reinforce things that we want to see more of, which we'll talk about in a little while. We can reinforce things that actually compete with that behavior of concern, things that give that child a different way of communicating, for example. And that would be one of our aims, is to reinforce other alternative behaviors that meet that same need once we've identified what that need is, that give the child other tools in their toolbox to be able to manage that situation. Or it may be that we are accidentally reinforcing the behavior of concern. So I guess the first time that behavior occurs, it could be through vicarious reinforcement, so learned from looking at other people in the environment. It could be opportunistic or instinctive. There could be a whole host of reasons why that behavior has occurred in the first instance. But essentially, a behavior occurs. It could occur spontaneously. It could be kind of an offshoot of another behavior that child is already displaying. And that behavior will gain an outcome of some description. And as we say, if it's a good outcome, it's repeated. If it's a bad outcome, it's not repeated. If that child engages in that behavior spontaneously and it gains a desirable outcome for them in that situation, then they're going to learn that in that same situation in the future, that behavior gains that desired response. And therefore, in the same situation in the future, that behavior is much more likely to occur. And that desired response will be one of those four functions: sensory, escape, attention, or tangible, depending on the context in which it occurs. It's important to recognize that when we refer to those four functions, I'll go back to it here. When we refer to those four functions, it's not sufficient for us to just say, right, that behavior is maintained by attention, or that behavior is maintained by escape. We have to really understand what is it, in relation to attention, for example, what is it about that interaction that child enjoys so much? What type of interaction are they really enjoying? Is it a really animated, excited type of interaction? Is it a really reassuring, comforting type of interaction? In what contexts does that child seek that type of interaction and need that type of interaction? In what conditions and for what reason? So it's not sufficient for us to just say, right, that behavior is due to that function. We need to understand, if we were going to really understand fully that behavior, we still need to understand what type of interaction is it, and in what circumstances. And the same with escape. It's not sufficient for us to just say, for example, that child's trying to get out of that environment. We need to know what it is about that environment that they're trying to escape from if we're going to really understand that behavior. And when we know what exactly it is that they're trying to escape from, as an example, then we can make sure that we alter their environment in the future to make sure that that thing that they're trying to escape from is no longer present. And we'll come on to that in a little while. But it's, yeah, just wanted to reflect on the fact that actually it's not sufficient for us to just be able to highlight the function. We've got to really drill down into what is it about that specific function that child really needs. So just to go through a bit of an example. So let's say we're working with an 8-year-old child who is autistic and non-vocal. The child's hungry. They don't have any vocal language to communicate that. So they communicate that through their behavior. So they communicate that by hitting out. So the child's hungry. They hit out with their parent, carer, or the professional working with them. The parent goes, I don't know what this child's trying to communicate with me. I'm going to offer loads of stuff, and eventually something is going to stick, something is going to meet that need and make that behavior stop. So eventually that parent offers food or drink, and that meets that child's need. That child was hungry, they hit out, they've offered food, that food meets that need. So next time they're in the same situation, the same behavior occurs because the child gets hungry again. They have no other way of communicating that they are hungry, that they need that food. That child then hits out to the parent, and the same cycle continues. So we can see that in the same conditions in the future, that behavior continues to occur. And that can occur, that can be the case in sort of the exact same conditions, like in the home, for example. That behavior can also generalize to other conditions. So it may well be that if that behavior is reinforced in one context, when the child is hungry at school, that behavior may occur. When the child is hungry in the community, that behavior may occur. So there will be a level of generalization where the child learns that actually, once this is a very effective way of being able to meet that need, that behavior occurs across a variety of different environments. So this is just a really basic example of that kind of that ABC cycle here. So the antecedent being that the child is hungry, the behavior is that the child hits out, the consequence of the outcome is that the parent offers food or drink to that child, and therefore that behavior continues to occur because it gained a desirable outcome. And I'm sure you'll have all heard the incredibly unhelpful advice of just ignore it, which is incredibly unhelpful advice, because the trouble with that advice is that it operates off this idea of extinction, and which is that, let's say in the previous example, child is hungry, child hits out a parent, parent offers food or drink. In that situation, if we were to just all of a sudden ignore that behavior, so that child is hitting out, and we just go, we're going to completely ignore that. We're no longer going to offer food and drink. We're just going to completely ignore that behavior entirely. What happens is the process of extinction. Is that when a behavior that has previously gained a desirable outcome suddenly stops gaining that desirable outcome, that child is very likely to start engaging in more aggressive and or varied responding. So if, for example, let's use the example of a vending machine. If every day I went to the same vending machine and I pressed D6 for my favorite chocolate bar every single day, and one day I go up to that vending machine and I press D6 and nothing happens, I'm going to start shaking the vending machine. I'm going to start hitting the vending machine. I'm going to start pressing D6 over and over and over and over again, hoping that eventually it's going to work, because every single time previously it has done. And the difficulty with that then is that if I'm pressing D6 over and over and over again, essentially what I'm doing is increasing the rate of that behavior. So let's say previously that child was hitting out at the parent. They might hit out once, the parent might offer them food and drink. If we were to suddenly start ignoring that behavior, the child may hit out again and again and again and again until eventually that reinforcer is offered. And it might well be the case that if the child realizes that they're hungry, they've hit out, hitting out hasn't worked, they may start kicking, they might start biting, they might start spitting, and then we might have no choice but to offer that food or drink. And then what we've done is we've reinforced a host of other challenging behaviors that child is going to incorporate into the repertoire. So actually just ignoring the behavior entirely all of a sudden can make that behavior quite significantly worse in the short term. Eventually, if you stuck with it, that behavior would trail off. But quite a lot of the time, what happens is that that behavior gets so significant that actually it becomes really difficult to eventually wait it out. And what we do instead is we end up reinforcing that behavior inadvertently. So I really definitely wouldn't advise just ignoring it. That is really not good advice. Instead, what we're going to want to do majority of the time is implement positive and proactive strategies. We need, and this is why identifying the function is so important, because you're going to need to know why that behavior is occurring in order to proactively meet that need. And you might need a specialist to help with that. Obviously, I've put in the details of my support, and I'll put them in at the end again. So you might need somebody's sort of support in being able to identify what the function of that behavior is, and in what situations and what environments that behavior occurs. But essentially, we need to be able to know what that behavior does for that child, what purpose it serves, if we're going to be able to positively and proactively meet that need. As an example, let's say that the child who was hitting out when they were hungry, if we are able to identify, this child always gets hungry around 11 o'clock or 3 o'clock or in the night or whenever it is, and we offer healthy snacks proactively, maybe 15 minutes before or 30 minutes before we know that that behavior is going to occur, that meets that underlying need. And once we've met that underlying need proactively, that behavior shouldn't occur, because if that child is communicating that they're hungry, if we've met that need and they're no longer hungry, then that challenging behavior is not going to occur. So that's one aspect, is that we meet the need positively and proactively. And that may be enough, that may be sufficient, and that may be sustainable for us to be able to do that. The other thing that we can do is teach the child, as we say, alternative ways of being able to communicate that's what they need. And that might be through picture exchange, it might be through Makaton sign language. You may need to consult a behavior specialist or a speech and language therapist for support and being able to help that child to learn new ways of communicating. But essentially, if that child finds a different way of being able to communicate that they're hungry through, for example, asking for a specific food item, like using Makaton sign for biscuits as an example, then that child will be able to find a different way to be able to say, this is what I need. And when that child finds another more effective way of being able to say, this is what I need, that behavior will become reinforced, because we'll go, I know why that behavior is happening. We respond appropriately to that child. That need is met immediately. It's met very effectively. That behavior is much more likely to be selected than the challenging behavior, because the challenging behavior, we weren't sure why it was happening. We were offering a host of different things, and eventually we got it right. If that child can ask for something very specific, then that need is going to be met almost immediately. So it's going to become very effective and very quick for that child to be able to make a specific request and for that request to be facilitated. So if we're teaching that child specific alternative ways of being able to communicate, then that is going to also be a very long-term and sustainable way of being able to support that child and reduce the likelihood of that behavior occurring. We are much further ahead of time than I thought we would be. So I'm just going to flick over to my questions tab to see if anything has been submitted yet. I'm going to refresh the page. If anybody has any questions that they would like to ask, please feel free to submit either via the link or via the chat function as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording